My younger brother, David, has always resented me, but not for the reasons you might expect. It wasn't jealousy, he was the favored child, not me. Our mother doted on him, doing everything from cooking his meals to handling his laundry. Even when it came to schoolwork, I was expected to help him, but the same courtesy was never extended to me. Despite this, I accepted my role. I was independent, and maybe that was my mistake, always being there for him without asking for anything in return. David, on the other hand, never lifted a finger to help me. He only came to me when he needed something. While I was quiet and studious, he was loud and aggressive. Much like our father, I also had a habit of being blunt, which I believe made my mother view me in a negative light. Because of her favoritism, David became the golden child. And at first, I didn't mind, but as we got older, things changed. David took pleasure in making my life miserable. He mocked me for wearing glasses, teased me about my height, and even invaded my privacy by reading my diary, only to tattletale about its contents to our mother. When I protested, my parents brushed it off as harmless sibling antics. But it wasn't harmless. He escalated his torment, nearly breaking my glasses, tampering with my food, and once even putting small stones in my cereal. Luckily, I noticed before I bit down. My mother's response? This is just how brothers bond. When I was bullied at school, instead of defending me, David joined in. He encouraged my tormentors, calling me names like ugly loser and hairy monkey. Once, during an argument, he even told me to kill myself. That one stung the most. I was struggling with my mental health at the time, and hearing those words from my own brother was devastating. Our father was often busy with work, and my mother always found a way to excuse David's behavior. Even when he attempted to set my hair on fire, she dismissed it as a just playing. It wasn't until my father finally noticed how out of control David had become that things changed. For the first time, Dad stepped in, warning David that his actions wouldn't be tolerated anymore. He even threatened to call the police. David, who had never faced consequences before, was visibly shocked. That night, my father came to my room, and for the first time, we had a real conversation. He admitted he had waited for David to grow out of his bullying phase, but now he realized my brother was just cruel. That moment was life-changing for me. I confided in my dad about everything I had endured, David's bullying, the abuse at school. The next day, my father made sure the school took action against my bullies and later enrolled me in MMA classes, telling me I needed to learn how to stand up for myself. Training in MMA changed everything. I became stronger, more confident, and soon, I had my first real confrontation with David. One day, he stole my pocket money, something I had been saving for months. I caught him just as he was about to leave with his friends. When I demanded it back, he laughed, mocking me for always running to Dad for help. Something inside me snapped. Before I even realized it, I punched him in the face. David fell back, stunned. I grabbed my money from his pocket and threw him down again. He started wailing, and my mother rushed out, horrified, not at him for stealing, but at me for finally standing up to him. She demanded my father punish me, but my dad simply asked for an explanation. When I told him what happened, he sided with me. He told David he was lucky all he got was a punch. If he had stolen from someone else, he could have been arrested. David didn't take it well. He threw a tantrum, screaming that he hated me before storming off to his room. But from that day forward, he kept his distance. He had finally realized I wasn't his punching bag anymore. Though he could no longer physically intimidate me, he still hurled insults whenever our parents weren't around. As he got older, his anger only grew, and soon he refused to speak to me directly, instead using our mother as a messenger. She always told me to be understanding, but I was done trying. When I finally left for university on a full scholarship, my father threw me a celebration. Even my mother seemed happy. David, however, barely acknowledged my achievement. Leaving home felt like escaping a prison. University was a fresh start. No more walking on eggshells. No more bracing for David's next attack. During my second year, I met Karen at a frat party. We hit it off instantly. She came from a religious background, so when we found out she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to marry immediately after graduation. Our wedding was small but beautiful. Our parents were happy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had everything I ever wanted. At that moment, I truly believed Karen was the love of my life. I had always imagined a monogamous relationship, one woman to come home to, share my life with, and build a future together. Despite the occasional interest from other women over the years, I never acted on it. I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. But then, I uncovered 2 affairs she had during our marriage, one with a married coworker that lasted for years, and another with an ex-boyfriend during a family visit. Some might say I was naive, and looking back, I can't completely disagree. Each time we went through a rough patch, I chose to forgive her. I didn't want our son growing up in a broken home. I believed we could overcome these hurdles. The affair with her coworker had happened when we were younger, and I chalked it up to youthful mistakes and poor judgment. For a while, things seemed to improve, though I could never fully trust her again. I tried to move past the doubts, telling myself if I forgave her, I had to truly let go of the past and work toward a fresh start. It's been 4 years since that second betrayal, and I thought I had made the right decision to give her another chance. Karen seemed to have changed. We were happy planning for our family's future, and I felt confident about our life together. But 3 months ago, everything came crashing down when she confessed to a long-term affair and suggested our son might not even be mine. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. Shock, betrayal, and disbelief overwhelmed me. I could hardly wrap my mind around the gravity of what she had just said. In a daze, I managed to ask why she'd kept such a devastating secret and how she could have done this to us. Her reaction was chillingly indifferent, as if she were detached from the pain she had caused. Her vague responses only left me with more questions, and I was left grappling with the shattered trust and the crushing uncertainty about my own family. I pressed her for the truth because I had every right to know the father of the child I'd been raising. After much prodding, she finally admitted it was David, my brother. I was stunned, unable to comprehend her confession. She explained that when I introduced her to my family and she spent time with us over the holidays, David, who was typically cold toward me, had been warm and polite toward her. She was glad because she didn't want to feel like an outsider. Karen wanted to be accepted into my family, so she made an effort to bond with my mom. She noticed the rift between David and me and asked me about it. I opened up, telling her about our strained relationship and how it might never be repaired because of unresolved feelings. Karen understood and started inviting David to our outings, hoping it would help bridge the gap between us. She would invite him to watch movies with us, picking films that catered to his preferences. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I can see now that it was a turning point. Karen told me that one day, David opened up to her about his struggles after a breakup. Feeling vulnerable, he turned to her for support. She admitted that he had flirted with her in a harmless way when I wasn't around. Eventually, things escalated. They began sneaking off to hotels and lying to me about working overtime. Half of her business trips were actually romantic getaways with David. The revelation made me sick to my stomach. She confessed that after their fling, she felt guilty and cut ties with him. That explained her sudden decision to leave early and go home instead of spending New Year's with me. Though I had tried to convince her to stay, she insisted on leaving. When we returned to school after the holidays, Karen acted like nothing had happened, and I didn't question it. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Karen admitted she didn't know if the baby was mine or David's. With no way of proving it, she chose to stay with me, knowing I was the more reliable one. We got married because of that uncertainty, and I had believed she was making a decision out of love and responsibility. Now, I was facing the reality that the child I loved as my own might not even be mine. I asked Karen if she had been sleeping with David recently, and she reluctantly nodded. She told me they had stayed in touch because of their undeniable chemistry. My brother, the person who had tormented me for years, was the one who had betrayed me like this. I asked her why she had married me if she wanted David. She said she didn't want to be the one to end our marriage, even though she had made a mistake. In her eyes, I was a wonderful father to our son, and she had chosen to stay with me because of that. I told her I was glad she finally came clean, but that I was leaving. Karen broke down, crying and pleading for forgiveness. She expected me to yell at her, but I stayed calm and methodical as I packed my things. She begged me to fight for her, saying mistakes happen in every marriage. When I didn't respond, she shifted tactics, telling me our son would suffer from a divorce. Children shouldn't be raised in broken homes. She cried, but I reminded her that I might not even be his father. Her response was to accuse me of being cruel. It seemed like she thought I would never leave her, that I'd always forgive her, but I had no patience left, no trust, and no desire to keep living a lie. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and laid everything bare. I told them about Karen's affair with David, how they had been sleeping together for years. The shock on their faces was unmistakable. My mother, true to form, tried to defend David at first, insisting her precious son would never betray me like that. I refused to let it go, telling them to stay quiet while I called David. I needed him to believe this was a private conversation, one where he couldn't deny the truth. When David answered the phone, I confronted him about the affair. He initially denied it vehemently, trying to shift the blame onto Karen. He claimed she was the one who had pursued him and blamed her for everything. He even went so far as to say that he was the better-looking brother and that it wasn't his fault women were attracted to him. I told him I was going to expose him to everyone. He mocked me, saying no one would believe me because he was the golden child. That arrogance was the moment I had been waiting for. I thanked him for confirming everything. Knowing our parents had heard the entire conversation, David fell silent. My mother, now looking at David with disgust, demanded an explanation. He stammered and tried to justify his actions, blaming everyone except himself. My father, usually quiet in his judgments, couldn't hide his disappointment. David, he said, his voice shaking with anger, what you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, it's a betrayal of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued the affair even after they were married. You've shattered the trust we had in you. I raised you both to value family, loyalty, and decency. What you've shown today goes against everything I've taught you. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Your actions have consequences. You've hurt your brother, and you've torn apart the bonds that held this family together. Your mother and I are partly to blame, but we will not tolerate this any longer. You're cut off from the college funds. In that moment, I felt vindicated. For years, I had been the victim of David's cruelty. Now, the truth was out, and for once, it was him who stood exposed, his actions laid bare for everyone to see. I've set everything up for you. You'll need to figure out how to pay for your university fees on your own. I will also stop funding your lifestyle. Do you think it makes you more of a man to sleep with married women? Let's see how you handle things without my money. Throughout this, I kept my composure, even though my instinct was to scream at David. Watching my father take charge and reprimand him was the ultimate form of vindication. I had exposed his true nature, and it was evident that he had underestimated the consequences. Despite David's continuous protests, my mother defended him, but my father cut the conversation short, shutting down his excuses without hesitation. After the call ended, my mother came over and hugged me. It had been years since we shared such an embrace, but in that moment, there was an unspoken understanding between us. She apologized for not believing me all this time. My younger self, at 14, would have never imagined that one day, I'd be vindicated and embraced by her in such a way. Soon after, my father helped me find a good lawyer for the divorce. Karen and her attorney tried to pull every trick in the book, demanding alimony, arguing that I earned more than she did. But her affair worked heavily in my favor. A paternity test revealed that David was the biological father of the child. The news hit me like a punch to the gut, even worse than learning of Karen's infidelity. The son I had raised and loved wasn't mine. I was furious, but I decided to stay strong and push through it. Karen pleaded with me to continue visiting our son, claiming he shouldn't be punished for the situation. But I couldn't bring myself to see him. He looked too much like David, and it stirred up a kind of anger I couldn't shake. After the divorce was finalized, I felt a sense of freedom as I moved into my own place, a bachelor pad. It felt surreal after marrying so young and never having had the chance to live independently. Yet, my naturally independent nature allowed me to adjust quickly, and I grew to enjoy my new lifestyle. 2 weeks ago, my dad called me to let me know he was considering changing his will. He no longer wanted to leave anything to David. My father is incredibly stubborn, and once he makes up his mind, there's no changing it. David reached out to our parents and even showed up at their door begging for forgiveness, but they refused to let him back into their lives. Even my mother, who usually gave in to David's tantrums, seemed resolute. Though it must have been hardest for her, David never contacted me to apologize for what he had done. Instead, he was only upset about being cut off from the family. Dad told me he planned to leave everything to me, making sure David couldn't contest it later. He would leave David only $1. I was shocked. My father had worked his whole life, and his estate, comprising his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance, was worth nearly $2 million. The only condition in his will was that if he passed away before my mother, she would continue to live in their house, though the ownership would transfer to me. I didn't mind this. I wanted to ensure my mom was well cared for in her final days. Somehow, David found out about this and, unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday to make amends. He told me he was struggling with college and, after Karen found out the truth about the paternity, she'd been pressuring him for child support. He claimed he had no money and was struggling to find part-time work. He begged me to talk to our family and help him start fresh, saying he really needed my help. I laughed in his face and told him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have thought about the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. David tried to argue, saying I was being unfair and that Karen was also to blame. I agreed, but reminded him that I had divorced her. She was now his responsibility, not mine. I told him he had no right to call me and complain about her or the child. These were the consequences of his own actions. He began to raise his voice, but I cut him off, telling him he was no longer the favored son. He was now the black sheep, the one who slept with his own brother's wife. David started crying, telling me how everyone, including our grandparents, had turned their backs on him. While it was true, it no longer mattered to me. I told him we were done, and that he should never contact me again. I no longer considered him my brother. Since that conversation, I've replayed it in my mind countless times. Despite my anger towards David, hearing him cry stirred something within me, something I hadn't felt since we were children. I won't lie, a part of me felt hurt, seeing him so vulnerable. So now, I'm left wondering, should I talk to our parents about him, or would it be wrong to stay out of it?